Well, Your Excellency, thank you for being with us today. I know that you're not an infrequent visitor to Australia, but very busy on the world stage, so we're grateful for your time.
Thank you, pleasure.
I'd like to start with part of your personal journey, if I might. When did you first become politically active and become engaged in sort of revolutionary ideas?
Politically active, socially active, but individually without being involved in any organization, in any planning, just, instinctively as a human being. I began to be conscious and active and angry at issues of poverty when I was a teenager. 16, 17, I remember I was already speaking out. But then more when I was 19 years old, and all had to do with poverty and the injustices. Nothing to do with ideology, with politics or religion as such. I'm not motivated by ideology. I'm not motivated by a religious belief that you have to do this because the Bible says this or the Quran says this or whatever. You know? It is my conscience as a human being that tells me something is wrong, there is injustice, there is poor person that is being persecuted, or there is a starving person, a starving family, and someone has to help. And then in my own way, I try to help. So that's have been my driving motive to do things.
And so that social justice imperative that you talk about there, how did that then lead you to the issue of independence?
Then obviously, again, as a thinking person, you end up thinking, why should the people of East Timor be ruled by Portugal or by Indonesia or by Japan? These are people separate. They are not part of any other country. Like any other country, any other people have the right to be free, to decide what form of government, to have their own national flag, anthem, a constitution, their own elected leaders, their government, etc., etc. For me, again, very basic. I don't sit down and grab books and read and be influenced by Marx, by Lenin, or by Buddha, or by whoever, No, I think this is a very basic, fundamental challenge to a human being's conscience, thought process. So for me, and it has to do with justice, social justice, human dignity. The independence for me has to do with that. Doesn't mean that independence, formal, political and legal independence, means all the issues of social justice have been resolved. No, unfortunately, tragically, in so many countries that fought for freedom, for independence from the Europeans, whether in Africa, Asia, Latin America, well, what independence brought to them an oligarchy that replaced the old elites, the old colonial elites. The country has a flag, a national anthem, has a government. Many are not even elected, but most of them all corrupt, all robbing the people, even more than the Europeans had robbed. So it doesn't mean necessarily that having attained nominal legal independence, sovereignty, that issues of social justice have been resolved. No, injustice happens everywhere, anywhere, anytime through history, in any place of the world, continue to happen. In Australia, in the US, only few countries, you might say, they don't have really issues of glaring social injustice. The Nordic countries, among the most egalitarian countries. You look at the stupidity, idiocy, hypocrisy of the communist system, because the communists were talking about egalitarian, absolute egalitarian. Well, you have the communist nomenclature, the communist elite live separately from the rest of the people, does not allow free speech, and they live absolutely well off, better than everybody else. But then you go to Norway, Sweden, and few other capitalist countries, well, it's more egalitarian. You know, Australia, you know, is one of the best, like Canada, is that social inequalities are not so profound, like you have in the US, or you have in some communist regimes.
So I suppose what you're saying is that you know, independence is a very important theme for a people or for a group of people to have, but it's not quite enough.
Not quite enough. Of course, in the context that you are in a free democratic country, like in Australia, and you are independent thinker, independent-minded person, you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do, to help others. You are in a far better situation than in any other status you might find yourself in, that you're a very independent-minded person, you live in a free, independent, sovereign country with absolute freedom of press, freedom of opinion, and you are financially independent, or you can be financially independent. That would be like the ideal situation for anyone.
So Australia came to play a role, I guess, in the push for independence in Timor-Leste. Have you got some reflections on the role that Australia played, and in particular, the role that Australia's Defence Forces played?
Yeah, I have a greatest respect for the Australian Defence Forces. Of course, I was familiar with it, going back to World War II, when Australians were in Timor-Leste fighting the Japanese. My immediate relatives, my mother was a very young child, a teenager, with a sister, their mother. They were with Australian forces not far from Dili, the capital, where my mother looked. Now she's almost 90 and suffers from some Alzheimer's. But way back 5 years ago, decades after World War II, every time she saw black and white pictures of Australian military in Timor-Leste, in the mountains, in the villages, she always recognized a certain Captain Ledlaw. She always said, that's Captain Ledlaw, because she was there with Captain Ledlaw. So I heard from her, from many other people. I read about Australians fighting during World War II in North Africa. I read about Australians fighting in Vietnam, etc., etc. Brave military people. In fact, during World War II, the Nazis, the Germans, they are most impressed with two forces. They are most impressed with black Americans, that were great fighters, and the Australians, as they encountered them in North Africa, from what I heard. So then in Timor-Leste, when they came in '99, and since then have been very disciplined. Thousands of Australian forces, and I have to say New Zealand also, you know, went through Timor-Leste over the years. Really, literally thousands. You know, they rotate every 6 months, every 2 years, every year. I don't recall the exact time. So through the years, you know, many thousands went through, and hardly there was a single incident of misbehavior involving Australian forces, New Zealand, against innocent local people. In fact, none. None of the problems you hear about UN peacekeepers in Africa, in the Central African Republic, abuse of local people, of boys, of girls, by even French troops. You know, some of the biggest scandal, 2014, 2015, in Africa were from French troops involved with the UN. You never hear of these kind of abuses by Australian forces in Timor-Leste. They're extremely careful, and so much so that some of our hooligans during some of our conflict, they were not afraid of the Australians because they always say, the Australians are not going to shoot at us. Because the hooligans, they're smart people. They know which forces they can provoke. So the Australians, they are not going to shoot at us. So I have greatest respect, and they've done tremendous job in Timor-Leste over the years. Then all the UN, Australian military personnel, New Zealand left by the end of 2012 when the situation was completely stabilized, till today. But we have ongoing defense cooperation. We have two countries basically with very strong defense cooperation with Timor-Leste, is Australia and Portugal. And both countries work very well, and both countries tremendously committed to Timor-Leste. But again, I emphasize New Zealand, because New Zealand, being smaller, sometimes we tend to forget, but New Zealanders have been also exemplary in their solidarity with Timor-Leste, defense cooperation, police cooperation, development assistance.
And so in terms of the current day, would you like to see Australia play a larger or a smaller role in the affairs of Timor-Leste or in the region?
We want Australia to play an even bigger role in Timor-Leste. I think we need Australia to expand defense cooperation, more training of Timorese military officers. The next 5-10 years, Timor-Leste will go through a very important, urgent transition in the army leadership. So we need to send more officers to Australia for Army Chief of Staff courses. We need to expand the training of our police force in Timor-Leste. We need to really have a more Australian private sector companies coming to Timor-Leste. I'm a friend of Andrew Forrest from Western Australia. A great human being. People might not know, but he's someone who is very sensitive to social issues. And he has visited me a few years ago, and he has sent his CEO to Timor-Leste to survey, to look at the possible areas of investment, tourism, agriculture, and mining. We need more people like that. We need serious investment, because the Australian government has been generous. It's our single most important development partner, with close to $100 million Australian a year to Timor-Leste. Is the largest. The second largest would be the European Union, maybe 25 million a year total. So Australia is by far. So Australian federal aid is significant, and I believe will be maintained. But now we need strong Australian private sector investments.
So what role would you like to see, for example, the Australian financial services industry play? We have a great wealth of experience in superannuation, in investment management, in financial advice. Would you like to see that industry in particular play a role?
For instance, we're spending so much money. My understanding is more than $100 million in paying off pensions to so-called veterans, real veterans, fake veterans, 2 widows, 2 orphans. We need to look at how to transform these pensions into an investment, because our people get the money and mostly spend it, and is unsustainable for our economy. So I have discussed this matter with the incoming Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, Mr. Mari Alkatiri. He's a very good, austere, strict money manager, and he is worried, like me, like the rest of us, on public expenditure, how to better manage our resources, our monies, how to control public expenditure, and how to convert these pensions that we pay off every month into an investment for the people, for the country. So Independent Financial Society of Australia could come to Timor-Leste as a group, as individuals, meet with our government, our banking sector, and provide strategic advice on how Timor can better manage our financial situation. I have been arguing and I'm making approaches to Dubai for a while now, looking at how could Timor-Leste be a small financial center in Southeast Asia. Why not? We're strategically located. Our taxes are the lowest, among the lowest in the world. Among 6 countries with the lowest tax in the world, one is Timor-Leste. We do have a good liquidity. We have like $16 billion in our sovereign fund. So how can we harness this and turn Timor-Leste into a respectable financial center in Southeast Asia?
Just finally, Your Excellency, I know you've been very involved in the more recent years with global efforts for peace through the United Nations and through other organisations. We do see, rising tensions, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Are you optimistic about the possibility of, ongoing peace and prosperity? And what should our top priorities be?
I might have been the only person who, for the last 10 years, in a number of speeches, of course, not many people read my speeches, which is a tragedy. I have delivered speeches in Singapore, in India, in Thailand, and these speeches are there on my website. And I always said, contrary to this overly optimistic view that we are dealing with a rising Asia and that global power has shifted from the West, from Washington to Asia. Contrary to that, I say, I'm sorry, my view, Asia is the most dangerous region of the world. The most fractured with rival nuclear powers. In Europe, you have 2 nuclear powers, France and UK, and they are the closest of allies in Europe. They don't point their nuclear weapons at each other. In Asia, you have neighbors with nuclear weapons, cousins with nuclear weapons pointing at each other. Look at India and Pakistan. These are brotherly countries, neighbors. They have a nuclear arsenal pointing at each other. They have unresolved border disputes, rivalry over the sovereignty over Kashmir, and they have clashed, they have killed each other in recent weeks. Then you have India and China, with nuclear weapons pointing at each other. Besides, there are land border disputes right now. There is an ongoing security confrontation in some land area near Bhutan between India and Indian and Chinese forces. Then you have the lunatic Kim Jong-un of North Korea developing nuclear weapons, threatening the US, threatening South Korea, Japan, and everybody else. Then you have rising Islamic radicalism, even in Indonesia, increasingly. And Indonesian friends are worried about rising extreme Islamic radicalism in Indonesia. Not to mention Malaysia, southern Thailand, Philippines. And then you have the South China Sea challenges. How can we say this is rising Asia? Of course, it rose population-wise. It's not difficult to have a rising population. You just have to make more children. You have a rising population. But at the same time, you have an aging population. The success of Asia in terms of growth, economic prosperity, has meant also that people living longer. So we have more aged people in China. I tell Chinese friends, one of your problems is your aging population, result of your family planning, draconian family planning. the result of a prosperity of the last 30 years, but you end up with a very old population. Superpowers are made of young people. The US is a superpower made of young people. And why? Because they renovate their population with migration, with people coming into the UK from Latin America, from Asia. One of the virtues of the US is that it's almost colorblind. China, Japan, South Korea are not colorblind. So they cannot renovate the population with their own. So I tell the Chinese, even if you install a missile on every wheelchair in China, because 30 years from now you will have 300 million people on wheelchairs, you put a missile on every wheelchair, you cannot fight the Americans. So this is a big, the Asian population, overpopulation, problem of resources. China has very little strategic resource. India has very little strategic resource. So they have to go to Africa, Latin America, looking for agriculture, minerals, and they look Australia, yeah. So these are some of the challenges that the UN, the world community face, and the world community is almost leaderless. Unlike post-World War II, where we had great leaders in the US, you have great leaders in Europe. Some of the greatest leaders came after World War II through the 50s and 60s and up to the 70s. And so right now, you know who we have in the US. In Europe, surprisingly, someone that I admire a lot, and the anchor of stability and economic prosperity in Europe is a woman, formerly from East Germany, Angela Merkel. I never had great admiration for her, but she has been amazing. And then look at UK, with Brexit. How these people, do they know what they are doing? UK will become a little England of all people on wheelchair out of the European Union. Instead of sticking together with the rest of Europe, they want to be indifferent. Well, it's no longer the old Britannia. It will be an old, helpless, little old lady on a wheelchair sitting somewhere in a street corner in Europe. So this is the whole situation today.
Well, it sounds like we should be paying more attention to your speeches. Jose Ramos-Horta, thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.